Hey guys, tonight we journey back to the quiet stone monasteries of medieval Europe, where thousands of men willingly abandoned ordinary life to embrace a world ruled by silence, discipline, and prayer. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy exploring history together. Now dim the lights, relax beneath your blanket. Perhaps let the rain fade into the background and allow yourself to wander through narrow monastery corridors where the sound of a single bell could determine every moment of an entire lifetime. For many people today, monks seem mysterious. They appear in paintings wearing long robes, carrying books, tending gardens, or silently walking beneath ancient arches. Yet the reality of medieval monastic life was far stranger than most imagine. These were not simply religious men who spent their days praying peacefully. They followed routines so strict that every hour was controlled. They often slept surprisingly little. They spoke less than many modern people speak in a single morning. Some voluntarily ate almost the same simple meals for decades. Others copied enormous books, one careful letter at a time, until their eyesight weakened with age. Their lives revolved around rules that governed nearly every action, from how they greeted one another to the exact posture they should maintain during worship. Although monasteries could appear isolated from the outside world, they quietly stood at the center of medieval society. Kings requested advice from respected abbots. Farmers depended upon monasteries during difficult harvests. Pilgrims traveled across dangerous roads, seeking hospitality behind monastery walls. Wealthy nobles donated land in hopes that monks would pray for their families. Travelers found shelter there. Scholars preserved forgotten knowledge there, and the poor often received food from their kitchens. Tonight's journey follows no legendary hero. Instead, it follows the ordinary rhythm experienced by countless monks whose names disappeared into history. Their stories survive not because they fought famous battles, but because they faithfully repeated the same demanding routines year after year. Those routines may seem unusual today, yet for centuries they shaped the lives of thousands across Europe. Imagine approaching a monastery just before dawn somewhere around the 12th century. The countryside remains wrapped in darkness. Mist hangs low over damp fields, while narrow dirt roads wind between scattered villages. In the distance stands a collection of sturdy stone buildings surrounded by walls. A bell tower rises above tiled roofs, visible long before individual windows emerge from the morning haze. The monastery was designed not simply as a place of worship, but as a complete community. Inside the walls were sleeping quarters known as dormitories, a large church, workshops, kitchens, storage rooms, gardens, barns, stables, and often a hospital for caring for sick brothers or weary travelers. Everything necessary for daily life could exist within those walls, allowing monks to remain largely separated from worldly distractions. This separation mattered deeply because medieval monks believed the outside world constantly tempted people toward pride, greed, violence, and unnecessary luxury. By withdrawing from ordinary society, they hoped to create an environment where spiritual discipline became easier to practice. Of course, reality rarely proved so simple. Human nature followed them through the monastery gates, long before sunrise, while nearby villages remained asleep. The first monastery bell echoed across the courtyard. For modern ears, it might sound peaceful. For the monks, however, it represented immediate responsibility. Sleep ended instantly. No snooze buttons existed. No lingering beneath warm blankets. Every monk climbed quietly from his narrow bed. Many beds were astonishingly modest. Depending upon the monastery and period, a monk might sleep on a simple straw mattress placed atop wooden boards. Pillows could be thin or absent altogether. Blankets provided warmth during harsh winters, but comfort was never considered the highest priority. Physical ease, many believed, risked encouraging laziness. The brothers dressed quickly, often in near darkness, illuminated only by candles or small oil lamps. Their clothing remained deliberately plain. Wool habits, simple belts, leather shoes, and modest hoods reflected ideals of humility rather than fashion. Individual expression mattered very little. Uniformity reminded everyone that personal pride should disappear before God. Conversation during these early hours was often forbidden. Instead of chatting while preparing for the day, monks moved silently through stone corridors toward the church. Only footsteps echoed. Perhaps an occasional cough interrupted the stillness. Otherwise, hundreds of men could gather without exchanging more than a glance. Silence itself became a spiritual exercise. Modern life constantly surrounds us with sound. Traffic, phones, music, conversations, advertisements, notifications, noise rarely disappears completely. Medieval monasteries intentionally cultivated the opposite atmosphere. Silence encouraged reflection, prevented gossip, and reduced unnecessary conflict. Maintaining silence, however, proved surprisingly difficult. Imagine living alongside dozens or even hundreds of people without casual conversation. Questions still needed answering. Work still required coordination. Meals still had to be served. Over centuries, many monasteries developed elaborate systems of hand gestures. A brother might signal for bread without speaking. Another gesture requested water. Different movements represented books, candles, tools, or specific rooms. These silent languages varied between communities, becoming practical solutions to strict rules against idle speech. Some surviving manuscripts even recorded these gesture systems in remarkable detail, revealing just how carefully everyday communication had evolved within monastery walls. The first service before dawn often lasted longer than modern visitors expect. Psalms filled the cold church, while candles flickered against carved stone columns. Voices rose together, not as professional singers performing for an audience, but as communities offering daily worship that structured every passing hour. Prayer defined time itself, instead of dividing life according to work schedules or entertainment. Monks divided each day through a sequence of religious offices: night prayer, dawn prayer, morning prayer, midday prayer, afternoon prayer, evening prayer, final prayer before sleep. Each service returned the community repeatedly to the church regardless of whatever task occupied them. Imagine planting vegetables. A bell rings. You stop immediately. Imagine baking bread. The bell rings again. Everything pauses. Copying a manuscript. Repairing a roof. Treating a sick traveler. Whenever possible. Prayer interrupted ordinary labor because spiritual responsibilities always held priority. To modern observers, this schedule appears exhausting. In many ways, it truly was. Certain monasteries required brothers to wake, while darkness still covered the countryside, leaving surprisingly few uninterrupted hours for sleep. During winter, cold winds slipped through cracks in ancient buildings, despite every effort to keep interiors warm. Thick stone walls helped during summer, but often retained damp chill during colder months. Heating an entire monastery proved nearly impossible. Only certain rooms enjoyed fireplaces. Many corridors remained cold enough that breath became visible. Imagine rising from a straw mattress before sunrise, pulling rough wool clothing over stiff muscles, and walking barefoot or in simple sandals across freezing stone floors toward a church where prayers might continue for an hour or longer. This happened not once, not occasionally, but day after day, year after year. Yet medieval monks rarely described such routines as extraordinary hardship. For them, discipline formed the very purpose of monastic life. Physical discomfort reminded them that earthly existence remained temporary, while spiritual goals lasted forever. After the first services concluded, daylight slowly entered the monastery grounds. Kitchen workers prepared simple breakfasts, if local customs permitted one at that hour. Different religious orders followed different traditions, and meal schedules changed across centuries. Some communities delayed eating until much later in the day, particularly during fasting seasons. Food rarely aimed to impress. Bread appeared almost daily. Vegetable soups filled wooden bowls. Beans, onions, cabbage, and herbs grew in monastery gardens. Cheese might accompany meals, depending upon local customs. Fish frequently replaced meat, especially on numerous fasting days observed throughout the Christian calendar. Large feasts certainly occurred during important celebrations, but ordinary days emphasized moderation rather than abundance. Even dining involved unexpected rules. Meals often occurred in complete silence, rather than chatting across long tables. Monks listened, while one designated reader stood before the community reciting passages from scripture or religious writings. Imagine eating lunch every day while someone calmly reads aloud instead of hearing conversation. The intention reached beyond simple discipline. Listening during meals ensured that nourishment benefited both body and soul simultaneously. Not every monk appreciated every reading. Not every brother remained perfectly attentive. Human minds wandered, then just as they do now. Still, the custom endured across generations, becoming one of the defining features of monastery life. Among newcomers, adapting to silence often proved more difficult than adjusting to modest food or uncomfortable beds. Many young novices arrived from lively villages where marketplaces buzzed with voices. Children laughed openly, neighbors exchanged news freely, and families gathered around evening fires. Inside monastery walls, words suddenly became precious. Every unnecessary sentence invited correction. Every careless remark carried consequences. Gradually, many novices discovered that silence revealed thoughts they had never previously noticed. Without endless conversation, worries became louder. Memories resurfaced. Temptations appeared unexpectedly. Prayer, they learned, demanded far more than simply speaking sacred words. It required mastering one's own restless mind. And for many brothers, that challenge had only just begun. The first pale rays of sunlight gradually reached beyond the monastery walls, illuminating damp grass, vegetable plots, and narrow stone pathways that countless feet had worn smooth over generations. As the shadows slowly retreated from the cloister, another bell echoed through the buildings. This bell did not summon the brothers to rest, nor did it announce a celebration. Instead, it quietly reminded everyone that prayer alone could not sustain a monastery. Every loaf of bread, every repaired roof, every carefully copied manuscript, and every healthy orchard depended upon steady, disciplined labor. Unlike the popular image of monks spending every hour kneeling before an altar, medieval monastic life demanded an extraordinary amount of practical work. The famous Benedictine principle, often summarized as pray and work, shaped daily existence across much of Europe. Spiritual devotion and physical effort were not viewed as separate responsibilities. They complemented one another. Digging a field with patience could honor God just as sincerely as singing a psalm inside the church. The monastery therefore awakened into quiet industry. Brothers dispersed across the grounds, each already aware of his assigned duties. Instructions rarely needed repeating because most responsibilities remained the same day after day, season after season. Routine itself became a teacher. Every monk understood where he belonged after the morning office concluded. Some walked toward the gardens, carrying simple wooden tools polished smooth by years of use. Others disappeared into workshops where carpentry, metalworking, candle making, weaving, or leather repair occupied the coming hours. Several entered the kitchens, where enormous iron pots already hung above carefully tended fires. A few elderly brothers moved toward the infirmary, prepared to care for monks whose bodies had grown weaker with age or illness. Others opened the heavy wooden doors of the Scriptorium, the room where books slowly came into existence, one careful letter at a time. From the outside, these tasks might appear ordinary, yet each carried unexpected challenges that modern life has largely forgotten. Consider the monastery garden. Today, many people imagine neat rows of flowers surrounding peaceful stone buildings. Medieval monastery gardens certainly possessed beauty, but they served practical purposes first. Every available patch of fertile ground mattered. Vegetables, herbs, medicinal plants, fruit trees, and sometimes vineyards occupied carefully planned spaces inside or just beyond the monastery walls. The brothers responsible for gardening understood the changing seasons almost instinctively. They knew precisely when beans should enter the soil, how deeply onions preferred to grow, which herbs survived harsh winters, and which plants soothed fevers or stomach illnesses. Their knowledge accumulated slowly through generations rather than formal scientific education. Each season quietly added another lesson. Rain could transform hopeful planting into disappointment. Unexpected frost destroyed tender shoots. Summer drought hardened the earth until every harvest became uncertain. Unlike modern supermarkets, medieval monasteries could not simply purchase replacement food whenever crops failed. Successful harvests directly influenced the health of the entire community. Consequently, gardening demanded both patience and resilience. Nearby, another group of brothers cared for orchards where apples, pears, cherries, and walnuts gradually matured over many years. Fruit trees represented long-term investments. A monk planting a young tree often knew he might never enjoy its largest harvests. Future generations would benefit from labor completed decades earlier. Such thinking shaped monastic life in remarkable ways. Many projects deliberately extended beyond a single lifetime. Church buildings required generations to complete. Libraries expanded slowly across centuries. Gardens matured patiently. The men who began these works rarely expected immediate rewards. Instead, they accepted that others would finish what they had started. That attitude feels surprisingly unfamiliar today, where success often arrives measured by immediate results rather than distant outcomes. Meanwhile, the monastery kitchens had already become centers of constant activity. Contrary to dramatic medieval feasts portrayed in films, everyday meals remained modest. Nevertheless, preparing food for dozens or even hundreds of people required careful organization. Bread dough needed kneading long before baking. Vegetables required washing and chopping. Large cauldrons of soup simmered steadily, while fires demanded continual attention. Smoke drifted upward through roof openings. Wood crackled beneath heavy pots. Water had to be carried repeatedly from nearby wells or streams. Nothing happened automatically. Every meal represented hours of unseen labor. Even obtaining clean drinking water involved considerable effort. Wells required maintenance. Buckets wore out. Ropes frayed. During dry seasons, dependable water sources became especially valuable. The simple act of filling wooden barrels occupied significant portions of the day for certain workers. Elsewhere inside the monastery walls, the blacksmith's hammer echoed rhythmically. Metal tools rarely lasted forever. Plow blades dulled. Kitchen knives chipped. Door hinges loosened. Locks required repair. Shoes occasionally needed new iron fittings. The monastery therefore relied upon skilled craftsmen capable of maintaining countless everyday objects. Although these brothers pursued religious lives like everyone else, their practical abilities became indispensable. Without functioning tools, fields could not be cultivated efficiently. Buildings slowly deteriorated, and ordinary work became far more difficult. The carpenter's workshop remained equally important. Wood served nearly every aspect of monastery life. Tables, shelves, beds, doors, barrels, chairs, wheelbarrows, window shutters, bookstands, even simple wooden spoons emerged from practiced hands that understood grain, strength, and balance. Few items were discarded casually. Broken furniture invited repair rather than replacement. Carefulness conserved precious resources. Waste reflected poor stewardship. While these practical activities unfolded across the grounds, another remarkable world existed behind the quiet doors of the Scriptorium. For many visitors, this room would have appeared surprisingly ordinary at first glance. Long wooden desks, high windows positioned to capture natural light, shelves holding precious manuscripts, ink pots, quills fashioned from goose or swan feathers, small knives used for trimming pen tips, parchment carefully prepared from animal skins. Yet within this seemingly simple room, countless books survived because generations of patient monks dedicated unimaginable hours to copying them. Printing presses did not yet exist. Every page required human hands. Every letter emerged individually. Every mistake demanded correction. Imagine opening a modern novel and realizing that someone had written every single word by hand. Now imagine producing hundreds of such books. That was the reality facing medieval scribes. Some manuscripts required months. Others occupied several years. The largest projects consumed decades. A single distracted moment could spoil hours of work. Ink blots occasionally spread unexpectedly. Parchment tore. Pens splintered. Candles produced insufficient light during cloudy afternoons, eyes gradually tired after endless concentration. Despite these frustrations, the copying continued. Many scribes developed astonishingly beautiful handwriting. Letters stood perfectly aligned. Decorated initials blossomed into colorful artwork. Margins filled with intricate vines, animals, or geometric patterns. Gold leaf occasionally transformed important religious texts into shimmering masterpieces. Interestingly, not every monk copying manuscripts maintained perfect seriousness throughout the day. Hidden among countless medieval books are small personal notes left by exhausted scribes. One wrote that his back hurt terribly. Another celebrated reaching the final page. Someone else simply thanked God that the manuscript was finally finished. A particularly weary copyist remarked that writing bent the back, dimmed the eyes, crushed the ribs, and troubled the stomach. Centuries later, those quiet complaints still feel surprisingly familiar. Human nature, after all, changes less than technology. The monastery library gradually expanded because of these patient efforts. Religious texts naturally occupied central importance, but many communities also preserved works of ancient history, philosophy, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and classical literature. Without countless anonymous monks patiently copying fading manuscripts, much of ancient knowledge might have disappeared forever. Few of those scribes imagined that centuries later historians would quietly thank them for preserving voices from civilizations long vanished. Not every monastery possessed equally impressive libraries. Some remained relatively small. Others accumulated remarkable collections, attracting scholars from distant regions. Large monasteries occasionally loaned manuscripts to trusted visitors who carefully copied them elsewhere, allowing knowledge to spread slowly across Europe. Books represented extraordinary value. Today, replacing a damaged volume often requires little more than visiting a bookstore or downloading a digital copy. In the Middle Ages, losing a manuscript could erase years of painstaking labor. Consequently, books received exceptional care. Chains sometimes secured especially valuable volumes to shelves. Storage rooms remained dry whenever possible. Fire presented a terrifying danger. One accidental blaze could destroy generations of intellectual work within hours. Outside, the rhythm of labor continued beneath the gradually warming sun. Fields stretched beyond monastery walls, where lay brothers and hired workers joined monks during demanding agricultural seasons. Plowing required considerable strength. Harvesting demanded endurance. Haymaking depended entirely upon favorable weather. The monastery could not ignore nature's timetable. When grain ripened, everyone understood the urgency. Storms showed little concern for carefully planned schedules. A single week of heavy rain sometimes threatened an entire year's food supply. Throughout these busy hours, another bell eventually echoed across the fields. Its sound floated over gardens, workshops, orchards, and distant farmland. Wherever possible, work stopped. Tools rested. Hands brushed away loose soil. Voices, already few, faded completely. The community slowly gathered once more inside the cool stone church. No matter how important the unfinished task appeared, prayer reclaimed the center of the day. Some brothers arrived with dirt beneath their fingernails. Others carried the smell of wood shavings, fresh bread, parchment, or forge smoke. Each returned from different responsibilities, yet all stood together beneath the same vaulted ceilings. For a little while, the noise of hammers, kitchen fires, scratching quills, and rustling leaves disappeared behind ancient hymns that had echoed through monasteries for generations. But beyond those peaceful walls, another challenge quietly waited, one that no amount of discipline could entirely prevent. Temptation did not remain outside the monastery gates. It had followed every monk inside. Temptation, the monks frequently discovered, did not always arrive dramatically. It rarely appeared as a stranger knocking upon the monastery gate, or as a wealthy merchant offering impossible riches. More often, it emerged quietly from within. A wandering thought during prayer, a growing irritation toward another brother, a desire for a larger portion at dinner, an unnecessary boast about completing difficult work. The medieval writers who filled monastery libraries often warned that the greatest battles took place not on distant battlefields, but inside the human heart. This idea shaped nearly every aspect of monastic life. The monastery was not built because its residents believed they were already perfect. Quite the opposite. Most monks viewed the monastery as a place where imperfect people spent a lifetime learning discipline. Entering the religious life did not instantly remove pride, jealousy, anger, laziness, or fear. Those qualities remained stubborn companions, requiring constant attention. Many young novices arrived believing that monastery walls would somehow silence every troubling thought. The first few months often shattered that expectation. Imagine a teenager leaving behind family, friends, familiar villages, and nearly every possession. The first days might feel exciting. Everything appeared new. The stone buildings inspired awe. The chanting echoed beautifully through the church. The older monks seemed wise and composed. Then ordinary routine settled in. The bells rang before dawn. The same corridors appeared every morning. The same prayers returned every day. The same simple meals arrived at nearly the same hours. Letters from family were rare. Visits became uncommon. Homesickness slowly crept into the quiet hours. Many novices discovered that silence gave memories more room to grow. A familiar face from childhood, the sound of laughter around a family table, the smell of bread baking in a mother's home, a younger brother chasing chickens across a village yard. Such memories often returned unexpectedly during long periods of quiet work. Medieval spiritual writers described these moments with remarkable honesty. They understood that leaving the world physically did not mean the world disappeared from one's thoughts. Some novices persevered. Others quietly admitted that monastic life was not their calling. Not everyone remained, although medieval monasteries valued commitment. They also recognized that forcing unwilling men to stay rarely created healthy communities. Those who continued gradually learned another unusual lesson. Humility was practiced in surprisingly practical ways. Modern audiences often think of humility as simply having modest opinions about oneself. Medieval monks certainly valued modesty, but they also expressed humility through everyday behavior. The youngest brothers frequently accepted the least desirable jobs, cleaning latrines, emptying refuse, sweeping muddy corridors after storms, washing cooking pots blackened by smoke, carrying heavy firewood through winter snow. None of these tasks attracted admiration. That, in fact, was partly the point. The work reminded everyone that no responsibility existed beneath their dignity. Even respected abbots occasionally performed ordinary labor. A wise leader understood that authority meant service before privilege. Of course, reality did not always match the ideal. Some abbots governed gently. Others became overly strict. Human personalities differed then, just as they do now. Historical records preserve stories of compassionate leaders who patiently guided struggling brothers. They also preserve accounts of abbots whose harsh discipline created unnecessary tension within their communities. The Rule of Saint Benedict, followed by many monasteries, repeatedly urged moderation. An abbot should correct wrongdoing. He should maintain order. Yet he should also remember mercy. Finding that balance proved difficult. One monastery might become famous for kindness. Another earned a reputation for rigid discipline. Conditions varied across medieval Europe because each community possessed its own history, resources, and leadership. Disagreements inevitably arose. Living with dozens of people under one roof guaranteed occasional conflict. Perhaps two brothers disagreed about how fields should be managed. Perhaps a copyist believed another monk handled valuable manuscripts carelessly. Perhaps someone repeatedly arrived late for prayers. Minor frustrations accumulated over time. Unlike modern society, however, escaping difficult relationships proved nearly impossible. There was no moving into another apartment across town. No simply avoiding an unpleasant coworker. The same faces appeared every day. The same voices chanted beside you every service. The same brothers shared every meal. Consequently, monasteries placed enormous importance on reconciliation. Allowing resentment to grow quietly threatened the harmony of the entire community. Some monasteries encouraged brothers to seek forgiveness before evening prayers whenever disagreements occurred. Not every apology came easily. Pride resisted. Embarrassment delayed conversations. Still, the effort remained part of daily discipline. Perhaps one of the strangest customs involved public confession of minor faults within the community. At certain times, monks openly acknowledged mistakes before their brothers. The fault might seem surprisingly ordinary: oversleeping after the morning bell, speaking when silence had been required, showing impatience during work, failing to complete an assigned responsibility. These admissions were not intended to humiliate unnecessarily. Instead, they reflected the belief that honesty weakened pride. Hidden faults, many believed, quietly gained strength. Acknowledged faults could begin to heal. Naturally, not every monk welcomed these moments. Confessing even small failures before respected companions required courage. Yet medieval spirituality repeatedly emphasized self-examination rather than pretending perfection. Another challenge came from something almost everyone experiences: boredom. At first glance, monastery life appears endlessly busy. Prayer, work, study, meals, more prayer, yet repetition shaped nearly every day. One winter resembled the previous winter. Harvest followed planting. Lent returned every year. The same psalms echoed through familiar stone halls. Routine created stability. It also tested patience. Some medieval writers referred to a peculiar spiritual struggle that often emerged during long afternoons. Modern historians sometimes connected with boredom, restlessness, discouragement, or what today might resemble emotional exhaustion. A monk suddenly found every task irritating. Reading became difficult. Prayer felt dry. Time appeared to move painfully slowly. The walls themselves seemed oppressive. The temptation arose to abandon everything. This experience was so common that early monastic authors devoted entire chapters to discussing it. They advised perseverance rather than panic. Continue working. Continue praying. Continue following the routine. Eventually, the heaviness would often pass. Reading those ancient descriptions today feels surprisingly familiar. Human beings across centuries have wrestled with discouragement in remarkably similar ways. The monastery also contained moments of quiet joy, although outsiders sometimes imagine medieval monks living in constant gloom. Surviving writings reveal something more balanced. Successful harvests brought genuine gratitude. A beautifully completed manuscript inspired satisfaction. Visitors occasionally shared fascinating stories from distant kingdoms. Festivals transformed ordinary meals into celebrations. Christmas and Easter filled otherwise quiet churches with extra candles, richer music, and special foods reserved for important occasions. Even laughter was not completely absent, despite popular stereotypes. Medieval monasteries were not places where smiling became forbidden. Several surviving stories describe monks with warm senses of humor. Others gently poked fun at absent-minded brothers who misplaced tools or accidentally nodded asleep during long readings. One famous medieval manuscript even contains amusing drawings hiding in the margins. Tiny rabbits chase hunters. Monkeys imitate scholars. Cats appear alongside mice engaged in ridiculous adventures. These playful illustrations remind us that the people creating these books remained recognizably human. They appreciated moments of amusement despite living disciplined lives. Animals themselves formed another unexpected part of monastery life. Cats often became valued companions because they protected precious manuscripts from mice. A single hungry mouse could damage parchment painstakingly copied over many months. Consequently, monastery cats earned practical importance. Dogs sometimes guarded livestock or accompanied workers outdoors. Bees produced honey for cooking and candle making. Horses transported supplies. Oxen pulled heavy plows. Even chickens contributed eggs to the community. Life inside monastery walls therefore involved far more interaction with animals than many modern visitors might imagine. The monastery rarely existed in complete isolation either. Travelers regularly arrived seeking shelter. Pilgrims crossed Europe on journeys to sacred destinations. Merchants requested overnight lodging. Poor families occasionally appeared hopping for bread. Nobles visited to discuss donations or local disputes. Messengers carried letters between religious houses. Each arrival briefly interrupted the familiar rhythm of enclosed life. Hospitality occupied an honored place within many monastic traditions. Guests received food according to available resources. Beds were prepared whenever possible. The reception varied depending upon the monastery's wealth, the season, and the number of visitors already present. Some famous monasteries welcomed hundreds of travelers during busy pilgrimage periods. Managing such hospitality demanded impressive organization. Yet these visitors also carried something impossible to grow in monastery gardens or copy in the Scriptorium. News. They spoke of distant wars, royal marriages, failed harvests in neighboring regions, new cathedrals under construction, ships arriving from foreign ports, diseases spreading across kingdoms, political changes, remarkable discoveries for communities living according to stable routines. Such conversations offered rare glimpses into the constantly changing world beyond the monastery walls. Some brothers listened with genuine curiosity. Others preferred returning quickly to familiar silence. Still, no monastery remained completely cut off from medieval society. The outside world always found quiet ways to enter. And before long, that connection would become impossible to ignore, because kings, nobles, bishops, and ordinary villagers would all begin asking something extraordinary from the men living behind those peaceful stone walls. The requests arriving at the monastery gate rarely sounded dramatic at first. A farmer asked whether the brothers might pray for a sick child. A widow hoped the monastery could spare a little grain after an especially difficult winter. A local noble requested that several monks celebrate Mass for the souls of his recently departed parents. A traveler simply wished for shelter before darkness made the roads too dangerous to continue. Individually, these requests seemed ordinary. Together, however, they revealed something remarkable. Although monks deliberately withdrew from much of ordinary society, society never truly withdrew from them. The monastery became a place where spiritual life and everyday reality met each other every single day. Long before universities became common, many monasteries also served as places of learning. Not every monk arrived already knowing how to read. In fact, many entered with only the most basic education. The monastery itself became their classroom. Young novices spent countless hours learning the Latin alphabet, practicing careful handwriting, memorizing prayers, and gradually understanding the language that united much of the educated Christian world. Latin was not the language spoken by most villagers outside the monastery walls. A farmer working nearby might never understand a sentence recited inside the church. Yet for monks, Latin opened the door to centuries of religious writings, ancient philosophy, Roman history, medicine, law, and theology. Learning it demanded extraordinary patience. Imagine beginning each morning by copying unfamiliar letters onto parchment. The teacher examined every stroke. Crooked lines invited correction. Misspelled words required rewriting. There were no printed exercise books, no pencils with convenient erasers. Mistakes remained visible unless carefully scraped away with a small knife. Education progressed slowly. Some novices learned quickly. Others struggled for years. Older monks often guided younger brothers with patient repetition rather than hurried instruction. Knowledge passed from one generation to another, much like a candle lighting another candle. No flame diminished. Instead, the room gradually became brighter. Reading itself was a surprisingly physical activity. Modern readers often imagine silently turning pages while sitting comfortably beside a window. Medieval reading frequently sounded very different. Many monks quietly whispered the words as their eyes moved across the page. Moving the lips helped maintain concentration. Libraries, therefore, contained a gentle murmur rather than complete silence. The sound was not conversation. Instead, dozens of soft voices repeated ancient words, almost like distant bees humming inside a garden. The books themselves deserved remarkable care. Parchment came from animal skins, prepared through lengthy processes. Ink required careful mixing. Colored pigments sometimes traveled enormous distances before reaching the monastery. Blue pigment could prove astonishingly expensive. Gold leaf demanded exceptional skill. Producing a single beautiful manuscript consumed resources that modern readers rarely consider. Consequently, dropping a manuscript carelessly or exposing it to damp, whether represented more than simple clumsiness, it threatened months or even years of labor. Many monasteries, therefore, assigned librarians whose responsibilities extended far beyond placing books upon shelves. They tracked valuable manuscripts, inspected damaged bindings, ensured books returned after being borrowed, protected collections from moisture, organized texts according to practical needs. Without realizing it, these quiet caretakers became some of Europe's earliest librarians. Not every monk spent his days studying books. Indeed, many could not devote much time to scholarship because practical responsibilities filled their schedules. The monastery required bakers, gardeners, builders, shepherds, mill workers, winemakers in certain regions, brewers in others, cooks, tailors, physicians, administrators, bell ringers, guest masters. Every community resembled a small village operating behind stone walls. One particularly important figure oversaw the storerooms, known in many monasteries as the cellarer. This brother managed supplies with extraordinary attention. Grain levels required constant monitoring. Salt remained essential for preserving food. Wine had to be distributed carefully. Candles could not simply disappear through carelessness. Firewood needed replenishing before winter arrived. The cellarer's decisions affected everyone. If he miscalculated badly, shortages followed. If he managed resources wisely, the community weathered difficult seasons with greater confidence. The Rule of Saint Benedict offered surprisingly practical advice regarding this office. The cellarer should avoid arrogance. He should not become impatient when brothers requested necessary items. Neither should he waste precious supplies. His work demanded fairness, balanced with prudence. Even centuries ago, successful administration depended upon trust. Another brother held responsibility that modern visitors might overlook entirely. Someone maintained the monastery clock, or rather, before mechanical clocks became widespread, someone maintained time itself. The passing hours were measured through bells, sundials, candles marked with divisions, and careful observation of daylight. Knowing when prayers should begin required experience. Cloudy, whether complicated matters. Winter shortened daylight dramatically. Summer extended it. The rhythm of the monastery depended upon accurate timekeeping, long before pocket watches existed, when mechanical clocks gradually appeared in later centuries. Monasteries became some of the earliest places to embrace them. Their structured routines benefited enormously from more precise measurement of time. Ironically, communities devoted to timeless spiritual concerns often became pioneers in organizing daily hours with remarkable precision. Illness inevitably visited monastery walls, despite every effort to maintain healthy routines. Colds spread through dormitories. Fevers weakened strong workers. Arthritis stiffened aging joints. Eye problems troubled scribes who spent decades reading by limited light. Dental pain, difficult to treat effectively, caused considerable suffering. Medical knowledge during the Middle Ages differed greatly from modern medicine. Yet, monasteries frequently preserved and practiced some of the best health care available in their regions. Many maintained herb gardens, specifically for medicinal purposes. Sage, mint, fennel, rosemary, lavender, yarrow, chamomile, dozens of plants served practical purposes beyond cooking. Experienced infirmarians prepared ointments, teas, poultices, and simple remedies according to knowledge, preserved through generations of observation and written instruction. Not every treatment succeeded. Some reflected misunderstandings about the human body. Others genuinely eased pain or promoted healing within the limits of medieval knowledge. Many monks sincerely sought to care for the sick with compassion. The infirmary itself often felt noticeably quieter than the rest of the monastery. Beds stood farther apart. Windows admitted gentle light. Visitors kept conversations brief. Brothers recovering from illness received additional food if necessary. Despite the monastery's usual emphasis on simplicity, mercy occasionally required flexibility. Strict rules existed for ordinary circumstances. Serious sickness changed priorities. This willingness to adapt reveals an important truth about many monasteries. Although discipline remained central, wise leaders understood that rules served people. People did not exist merely to satisfy rules. The changing seasons influenced every aspect of monastic life. Spring filled gardens with cautious optimism. Fields demanded plowing. Fruit trees blossomed. Lambs appeared in nearby pastures. The entire countryside seemed to awaken after long winters. Summer brought exhausting labor. Harvests could not wait. Hay required gathering, while weather remained favorable. Long daylight hours allowed more work, yet heat tested endurance. Autumn transformed the monastery into a place of preparation. Grain-filled storage barns. Apples became cider. Firewood accumulated. Vegetables were preserved for colder months. Everyone understood that winter rewarded careful planning. Then winter arrived. Snow covered pathways. Ice formed around wells. Travel became difficult. The surrounding countryside grew unusually quiet. Inside the monastery, candles burned longer because darkness came early. The church felt colder despite every effort to warm it. Breath sometimes drifted visibly through the air during lengthy services. Yet life continued. The bells still rang. Prayers still echoed. Books were still copied. Meals were still prepared. The rhythm rarely stopped. Some monks secretly appreciated winter. Outdoor labor decreased. More time became available for reading and copying manuscripts. Others longed eagerly for spring's return. Even within disciplined communities, personal preferences quietly persisted. Death also formed an ordinary part of monastery life. Modern society often keeps death at a respectful distance. Medieval monasteries encountered it regularly. Elderly brothers who had shared meals, prayers, and work for decades eventually grew frail. The community cared for them as strength slowly faded. When death came, it rarely surprised those who had witnessed the gradual decline. Funeral prayers gathered the entire monastery. The deceased brother was remembered not for wealth or worldly success, but for faithful perseverance. Many monasteries buried their dead within the monastery grounds. Simple graves reflected the ideals that had shaped their lives. No grand monuments, no elaborate displays, only quiet remembrance among brothers who believed earthly life represented the beginning rather than the conclusion of the journey. Walking through an old monastery cemetery today, one quickly notices how many names disappeared completely, whether erased inscriptions, wooden markers decayed, records vanished, history remembered only a handful of famous abbots or scholars. The overwhelming majority remained anonymous. Yet anonymous does not mean unimportant. Every meal served, every roof repaired, every garden planted, every prayer offered, every manuscript copied, every guest welcomed. These ordinary acts sustained communities across centuries. The history of medieval monasteries was not built solely by exceptional individuals. It rested upon thousands of quiet lives lived with remarkable consistency. As the years passed, some monks spent 50 or 60 years within the same walls. They watched young novices become experienced elders. They saw abbots come and go. Buildings expanded. Gardens changed. Kings rose and fell beyond the monastery's fields. Wars reshaped distant borders. Generations outside hurried onward. Inside, the familiar bells continued, marking the passing hours. Yet, despite this appearance of stability, enormous changes were approaching. New religious movements would question old traditions. Powerful rulers would discover that wealthy monasteries possessed something extremely valuable. And before many centuries had passed, countless peaceful communities that had stood for generations would face challenges unlike anything their founders had ever imagined. At first, those distant changes seemed too far away to disturb the ordinary rhythm of monastery life. A traveler might mention that a king had claimed another province. A merchant could report unrest in a neighboring duchy. Pilgrims sometimes carried rumors that bishops disagreed over church matters hundreds of miles away. The brothers listened politely, offered hospitality, and then returned to their familiar routines. After all, the monastery bell still rang before dawn. The gardens still required tending. The cows still needed milking. The manuscripts still waited upon their desks. It was easy to believe that the outside world would continue changing, while the monastery remained much the same. History, however, rarely allows any place to remain untouched forever. Even the thickest stone walls could not keep out politics, economics, or human ambition. One reason monasteries attracted increasing attention was surprisingly simple. Many had become prosperous. This prosperity often creates misunderstanding today. People sometimes imagine monks secretly collecting great personal wealth while preaching simplicity. The reality was considerably more complicated. Individual monks usually owned very little. A brother entering many religious orders formally surrendered personal property. His clothing belonged to the monastery. His bed belonged to the monastery. The books he copied belonged to the monastery. Even the tools he used belonged to the community, rather than to him personally. If he died, there was almost nothing to distribute, because almost nothing had ever belonged exclusively to him. The monastery itself, however, could become wealthy over generations. This wealth did not usually appear as piles of gold hidden beneath church floors. Instead, it existed in land. Fields stretched beyond the walls. Forests provided timber. Mills ground grain for nearby villages. Fish ponds supplied food during fasting seasons. Vineyards produced wine. Orchards yielded fruit. Large barns stored harvests. Rental income arrived from tenants farming monastery lands. Generous nobles donated estates. Hopping the monks would pray for their souls. Kings occasionally rewarded loyal monasteries with additional property. Over several centuries, some communities accumulated thousands of acres. Managing these lands required organization equal to that of many noble households. Not every monastery became wealthy. Countless smaller communities struggled simply to survive. Poor harvests, disease among livestock, floods, fire, local warfare, any of these disasters could reduce prosperous years to desperate ones. Still, the largest monasteries occasionally controlled enough resources to influence entire regions. That influence naturally attracted attention. With influence came responsibility. Abbots often found themselves making decisions extending far beyond monastery walls. Nearby villagers occasionally asked them to settle disagreements. Farmers sought advice during difficult seasons. Local nobles invited respected abbots to witness legal agreements. Kings requested prayers before military campaigns. Bishops consulted learned monks regarding theological questions. Some abbots reluctantly became important political figures, despite preferring quieter lives. Balancing those responsibilities proved difficult. The ideal monastery remained separated from worldly affairs. Reality repeatedly pulled its leaders back toward them. Imagine serving as abbot of a respected monastery. Before breakfast, you supervise repairs to a leaking roof. Later, you settle an argument between two brothers over workshop duties. By midday, a messenger arrives carrying a letter from a local lord requesting mediation in a land dispute. That afternoon, travelers require lodging. The infirmary needs additional herbs. The cellarer reports grain, supplies lower than expected. A novice wishes to discuss doubts about his vocation. Evening prayers approach. Tomorrow promises similar demands. Leadership inside a monastery involved far more than conducting worship. The Rule of Saint Benedict compared the abbot to a shepherd responsible for every member of the flock. A careless shepherd endangered everyone. A wise one protected both the strong and the weak. Not every monastery elected its abbots in the same manner. Many communities chose leaders from among experienced monks through careful discussion and voting. Age alone did not guarantee selection. Neither did scholarly ability. The brothers generally sought someone known for sound judgment, patience, fairness, and spiritual maturity. At least, that remained the ideal. Human politics occasionally influenced elections. Powerful families sometimes attempted to secure prestigious positions for favored relatives. Kings occasionally pressured monasteries to accept particular candidates. Such interference frustrated reformers who believed religious communities should choose leaders freely. These tensions surfaced repeatedly throughout medieval history. The monastery also depended upon another important group, often overlooked in popular descriptions: lay brothers. Unlike choir monks, whose days centered heavily upon study and the full cycle of liturgical prayer, lay brothers generally focused more upon manual labor. Many worked fields, maintained buildings, cared for livestock, operated mills, constructed walls, repaired roads. Some possessed limited formal education, while others became highly skilled craftsmen. Their contribution proved indispensable. Without them, many large monasteries simply could not function efficiently. Although their daily schedules sometimes differed from those of choir monks, they remained respected members of the same religious community. Life within the monastery, therefore, involved far greater diversity than outsiders often realized. Not everyone copied illuminated manuscripts. Not everyone spent long hours reading theology. Some brothers understood horses better than books. Others knew medicinal herbs better than politics. One monk might become famous for beautiful singing, another for repairing water wheels. another for growing exceptional pairs. Holiness, many believed, could flourish through faithful performance of ordinary responsibilities. Visitors occasionally expressed surprise at the monastery's remarkable self-sufficiency. Walking through the grounds, they encountered workshops producing candles, cloth, barrels, shoes, furniture, tools, and countless everyday necessities. The smell changed as one moved through different areas. Fresh bread drifted from the bakery. Wood shavings scented the carpenter's shop. Leather filled the air near the cobbler. Herbs dried beneath covered walkways. Smoke rose from blacksmith forges. Bees hummed around flowering gardens. The monastery resembled a carefully organized village, more than a solitary place of retreat. Water management represented another impressive achievement. Many monasteries diverted nearby streams through channels serving multiple purposes. Flowing water powered mills grinding grain into flour. It supplied fish ponds, irrigated gardens, removed waste, filled storage cisterns. Engineers today still study some medieval water systems because of their practical ingenuity. The monks who supervised these projects rarely described themselves as engineers, yet through observation, experience, and patient experimentation, they solved remarkably complex problems. Time rewarded careful planning. An efficiently designed mill could serve surrounding communities for generations. Construction itself demanded extraordinary patience. Suppose the monastery decided to build a new chapel or expand its church. The project might begin with little more than chalk lines drawn upon the ground. Stone arrived slowly by wagon. Timber required cutting and seasoning. Skilled masons shaped enormous blocks using hand tools. Scaffolding climbed steadily upward. Years passed, sometimes decades. The youngest workers eventually became middle-aged before the final roof was completed. Occasionally, builders who laid the foundations never lived to see the finished structure. Their successors quietly continued where they had left off. Such long-term thinking shaped nearly every major undertaking. Modern deadlines measured in weeks would have seemed astonishingly hurried. The monastery calendar also followed a rhythm unfamiliar to modern life. Religious festivals punctuated the year with changing colors, prayers, music, and meals. Ordinary weekdays differed noticeably from feast days. During major celebrations, additional candles illuminated the church. Extra bread appeared upon tables. Wine flowed a little more generously. The choir sang with particular joy. These moments reminded the brothers that discipline and celebration belonged together rather than opposing one another. Fasting seasons created the opposite atmosphere. Meals became simpler. Reflection deepened. Certain pleasures were voluntarily set aside for a time. The changing calendar gently shaped emotional life throughout the year. Perhaps the greatest surprise for a modern visitor would have been discovering how much waiting filled monastic existence, waiting for crops to mature, waiting for parchment to dry, waiting for winter to end, waiting for ink to settle, waiting for travelers, waiting for bells, waiting for God's timing rather than one's own impatience. Patience ceased to be merely a virtue discussed in sermons. It became unavoidable. Not every brother mastered it. Some remained restless throughout life. Others gradually developed remarkable calm. Visitors occasionally remarked upon elderly monks whose peaceful manner seemed almost effortless. That tranquility had not appeared overnight. It had been cultivated through thousands upon thousands of ordinary days. Yet beyond the monastery fields, Europe itself continued changing. Trade routes expanded. Towns grew larger. Universities attracted ambitious scholars. New ideas traveled farther and faster than before. Young people increasingly found opportunities unavailable to previous generations. The world outside the monastery walls was becoming more connected, more prosperous in some places, and more complicated. These developments would quietly raise an uncomfortable question. If educated men could now study in universities, if growing cities offered new opportunities for service, if learning no longer existed almost exclusively behind monastery walls, then what unique role should monasteries continue to play? It was a question that would challenge religious communities for centuries to come, and the answer would reshape monastic life in ways that none of those quiet brothers, walking beneath their familiar cloisters, could yet imagine. For centuries, monasteries had answered that question almost without speaking. They prayed. They preserved knowledge. They welcomed strangers. They cultivated land that others had abandoned. They cared for the sick when few alternatives existed. They copied books that would otherwise have disappeared forever. In many parts of medieval Europe, that had been more than enough. Yet by the late Middle Ages, Europe itself no longer resembled the world in which many famous monasteries had first been founded. The population slowly increased after long periods of hardship. Markets expanded. Stone bridges connected growing towns. Merchant families accumulated fortunes that once belonged almost exclusively to kings and nobles. Universities appeared in places like Paris, Bologna, Oxford, and Cambridge, attracting students from every corner of Europe. Learning, once concentrated inside monasteries, now flourished in bustling cities as well. For the monks, this changing world brought both opportunities and challenges. Young men considering religious life suddenly had more choices than their grandfathers ever imagined. A gifted scholar might travel to a university instead of entering a monastery. An ambitious administrator could serve a royal court. A talented physician might practice medicine in a growing town. The monastery no longer stood alone as the primary destination for educated people. Some religious communities adapted successfully. Others struggled. Within monastery walls, thoughtful abbots began asking difficult questions. How could ancient traditions remain meaningful without becoming frozen in the past? How should centuries-old rules apply to a rapidly changing society? How much contact with the outside world strengthened a monastery, and how much slowly weakened it? No simple answers existed. Different communities reached different conclusions. Some embraced careful reform. Others resisted change almost entirely. Still others drifted quietly into comfortable routines that gradually lost the energy of earlier generations. Human nature, after all, changes very little across the centuries. Success itself sometimes created unexpected problems. Imagine a monastery founded hundreds of years earlier by a handful of determined monks living in simple wooden buildings beside a lonely forest. Their days were difficult. Food remained scarce. Their clothing was coarse. They personally cleared trees, planted fields, and built the first chapel with their own hands. Generation after generation passed. Now imagine returning 300 years later. The wooden chapel has become an impressive stone church. Beautiful stained glass windows fill the interior with colored light. The library contains hundreds of valuable manuscripts. Visitors arrive almost daily. The monastery owns prosperous farmland extending beyond the horizon. Comfort has quietly replaced hardship. Nothing about this transformation appears inherently wrong. Yet many medieval writers wondered whether increasing prosperity also carried hidden dangers. Several spiritual authors warned that wealth rarely announced itself as an enemy. Instead, it arrived gradually. A slightly better meal, a softer mattress, more elaborate clothing, additional decorations, greater concern for reputation. None of these changes seemed serious by themselves. Together, however, some feared they slowly shifted attention away from the original purpose of monastic life. Not every monastery experienced such concerns. Many remained genuinely modest throughout their existence. Nevertheless, criticism occasionally emerged from both inside and outside religious communities. Reform movements arose repeatedly during the Middle Ages. Groups of monks argued that monasteries should return to stricter observance of their founding ideals. One generation believed the previous generation had become too comfortable. The next generation sometimes repeated the same criticism. History moved in cycles. Discipline relaxed. Reform renewed it. Prosperity increased. Another reform followed. These patterns appeared again and again across medieval Europe. Interestingly, the loudest critics were often monks themselves. They did not oppose monastic life. Quite the opposite. They loved it deeply enough to believe it deserved renewal whenever standards declined. This willingness to criticize one's own institution distinguishes many medieval reformers. They hoped not to destroy monasteries, but to strengthen them. Meanwhile, daily life continued much as it always had. The bells still marked every passing hour. Morning mist still drifted across monastery gardens. The scriptorium remained busy. The bakery filled the air with the familiar smell of fresh bread. The infirmary cared for aging brothers whose joints had stiffened after decades of work. Young novices still learned their first Latin prayers. Old monks still remembered teachers who had died many years earlier. One generation quietly replaced another. Perhaps nowhere did this continuity appear more clearly than in the monastery cemetery. Simple graves gradually filled the enclosed burial ground. An elderly monk, walking there might remember nearly every name. Here rested the brother who taught him to read. Nearby lay the gardener who knew every medicinal herb. Beyond stood the grave of the blacksmith, whose hammer had echoed through the workshops for 40 years. Each stone represented an ordinary life. Few had become famous. Most had never traveled far from the monastery walls. Yet together, they had sustained a community that outlived kingdoms. The cemetery also reminded every monk of an unavoidable truth. Life moved quickly. A novice entering the monastery at 17 sometimes imagined old age as unimaginably distant. Then, almost without noticing, gray hair appeared. Young brothers began asking him for advice. The same corridors he once explored with curiosity became deeply familiar. The bell that had once seemed impossibly early eventually woke him before it even rang. Routine transformed strangers into lifelong companions. One medieval abbot reportedly observed that perseverance often mattered more than brilliance. A monk did not become holy through a single dramatic act. He became faithful by quietly choosing the same good habits thousands of times. That philosophy shaped almost every corner of monastery life. Patience over excitement, consistency over sudden enthusiasm, steady labor over spectacular achievement. Modern society frequently celebrates dramatic success stories. Medieval monasteries often celebrated endurance. Another fascinating aspect of monastic culture involved memory, because communities endured for centuries. Preserving their own history became important. Monks carefully recorded the names of abbots, major donations, construction projects, terrible famines, exceptional harvests, fires, royal visits, natural disasters, unusual weather, even eclipses, occasionally found their way into monastery chronicles. These records now provide historians with priceless glimpses into everyday medieval life. A monk writing a brief note about an unusually cold winter could never have imagined that hundreds of years later scientists might use his observation to study historical climate patterns. Another recorded the arrival of an unfamiliar disease affecting nearby villages. Others described floods washing away bridges. Some mentioned bright comets crossing the night sky. Most wrote simply because they believed future generations deserved accurate records. Without intending it, they became historians. Their chronicles rarely focused solely on kings and battles. Instead, they described harvests, prices, weather, local customs, ordinary people. In many ways, they preserved the heartbeat of medieval society, rather than only its greatest political events. Of course, not every record proved perfectly accurate. Rumors occasionally appeared alongside facts. Miraculous stories reflected sincere beliefs of the age. Different chroniclers interpreted events through their own experiences. Modern historians compare multiple sources carefully before reaching conclusions. Even so, monastery records remain among the richest surviving windows into medieval Europe. As evening gradually approached, another familiar transformation unfolded. Workers returned tools to their proper places. The blacksmith allowed the forge to cool. Kitchen fires settled into gentler flames after the evening meal. The library grew quieter as fatting sunlight made reading increasingly difficult. Birdsong softened across the gardens. Long shadows stretched through the cloister. The brothers gathered once more inside the church. Candles flickered against ancient stone, walls exactly as they had for generations. Voices rose together in evening prayer. Some monks had sung these same psalms for 50 years. Young novices still stumbled over unfamiliar passages. Old voices blended with young ones. The community became, for a brief moment, a single choir joined across differences in age, education, and responsibility. Afterward, silence gradually settled over the monastery. Once again, the great doors closed. Visitors retired to the guest house. The infirmarian made one final round among the sick. A few brothers lingered briefly beneath the stars before returning indoors. Above them stretched a sky almost unimaginably dark by modern standards. No electric lights glowed on the horizon, only moonlight, starlight, and the occasional lantern illuminated the night. Tomorrow would resemble today. Another bell, another cycle of prayer, another day of work, another opportunity to practice patience. For many monks, that predictability became a source of deep peace. Yet history was already gathering beyond the horizon. A series of disasters, famine, plague, political upheaval, and war would soon test these peaceful communities more severely than any generation than living could possibly foresee. The first warning did not arrive with armies or burning cities. It came quietly. A merchant from a distant port mentioned that harvests had failed in lands far to the south. Several months later, another traveler repeated similar stories from entirely different regions. Prices for grain began creeping upward in nearby markets. At first, the monks paid little attention. Poor harvests were nothing unusual in medieval Europe. Every generation experienced difficult years. A cold spring, too much rain, not enough rain, an early frost, locusts, plant diseases. Nature constantly reminded people that survival depended upon forces beyond human control. Most monasteries, therefore, prepared carefully for uncertainty. Granaries were inspected regularly. Older grain rotated with fresh harvests. Salted food remained stored for emergencies. Wine barrels were checked. Firewood accumulated before winter. These practical habits had protected communities through countless difficult seasons. Surely this hardship would also pass. But it did not. The weather behaved strangely. Across large parts of Europe, heavy rains lingered far longer than usual. Fields became waterlogged. Seeds rotted before sprouting. Hay spoiled where it lay. Roads dissolved into thick mud, making travel painfully slow. Oxen struggled to pull wagons through flooded tracks. Bridges collapsed beneath swollen rivers. Even experienced farmers admitted they had rarely seen conditions quite like this. Inside the monastery, the effects appeared gradually rather than all at once. The vegetable gardens produced less than expected. The wheat harvest disappointed everyone. Fruit trees carried fewer apples. The cellarer quietly recalculated food supplies. Instead of planning comfortably for the coming year, he now measured every barrel and every sack of grain with increasing caution. Nothing was wasted. Bread became slightly smaller. Soup contained more vegetables and fewer precious ingredients. Festival meals remained simpler than tradition usually allowed. No one complained openly. Everyone understood why. Beyond the monastery walls, however, anxiety spread more rapidly. Villagers had fewer reserves than large monasteries. Many families depended almost entirely upon each year's harvest. When crops failed twice, or even 3 times, ordinary hardship transformed into genuine hunger. Soon the monastery gate received more visitors than usual. Not pilgrims, not merchants, hungry people, a mother carrying a child too weak to walk, an elderly farmer whose own stores had already disappeared, widows asking whether a little bread remained, entire families hopping for any assistance. For the monks, these moments created painful decisions. The monastery itself possessed limited supplies. Giving away everything immediately might leave the brothers hungry before winter ended. Refusing desperate neighbors contradicted centuries of Christian charity. Finding balance demanded wisdom. Many abbots responded by opening monastery granaries as generously as circumstances allowed. Bread was distributed. Soup kettles grew larger. Some monasteries organized regular meals for the poor. Others reduced their own portions to stretch available food further. Historical records describe brothers voluntarily accepting greater hardship so nearby villages might survive. Not every monastery possessed enough resources to help significantly. Some struggled alongside everyone else. Yet many communities became lifelines during years of scarcity. One anonymous chronicler wrote, with heartbreaking simplicity, that so many hungry people arrived each day that the gates seemed never to close. His brief sentence says more than pages of statistics ever could. Inside the kitchens, ordinary routines changed. Recipes adjusted according to whatever ingredients remained available. Beans replaced grain whenever possible. Wild herbs supplemented cultivated vegetables. Nothing edible went unused. Even stale bread found new purpose in soups and stews. Waste became almost unthinkable. The brothers who worked in the gardens searched carefully for every possible source of nourishment. Meanwhile, the infirmary filled with people weakened not only by illness, but by malnutrition. Poor nutrition made ordinary diseases far more dangerous. Minor infections lingered. Children recovered slowly. Elderly villagers often lacked the strength to survive long winters. The monks understood that medicine alone could accomplish little when empty stomachs remained the deeper problem. The monastery physician might prepare herbal remedies with great care, yet without sufficient food, many patients continued declining. Watching such suffering tested even experienced brothers. Prayer offered comfort. It did not magically refill empty granaries. During these difficult months, another remarkable quality of monastic life became especially visible: organization. Because monasteries had maintained careful records for generations, many knew approximately how much grain previous harvests had produced. They understood which fields drained poorly after heavy rain. They recognized which crops survived difficult weather better than others. Experience accumulated slowly across centuries. Each generation quietly passed practical knowledge to the next. Those lessons now proved invaluable. Older monks remembered earlier famines. They advised younger brothers about preserving food, managing livestock, repairing damaged ditches, protecting remaining crops. Memory itself became a valuable resource. Not every lesson appeared in books. Some survived only because experienced men patiently taught newcomers. Outside, the countryside looked strangely different. Fields that usually shimmered with healthy grain now contained patches of standing water. Abandoned farmhouses appeared more frequently along isolated roads. Some families left in search of better opportunities elsewhere. Others remained despite worsening conditions. Travelers increasingly shared stories of entire regions struggling simultaneously. This was no ordinary local failure. The hardship stretched across kingdoms. Trade, which normally eased shortages by moving food from one area to another, also suffered. Flooded roads delayed wagons. Damaged bridges interrupted familiar routes. Banditry increased, where desperate men saw few alternatives. Merchants hesitated to risk valuable cargo through dangerous countryside. Food became scarcer precisely when people needed it most. The monastery guest house reflected these changing times. Months earlier, travelers had discussed markets, festivals, distant cathedrals, and successful pilgrimages. Now conversations revolved around grain prices, failed harvests, livestock losses, villages abandoned, children growing weak. Hope mixed uneasily with uncertainty. Yet amid these difficulties, daily worship continued. Some outsiders found this surprising. Why maintain the full rhythm of prayers when so many practical problems demanded attention? The monks answered not through arguments, but through routine. Work and prayer had never competed with one another. One strengthened the other. After distributing bread to hungry visitors, the brothers returned to the church. After repairing damaged roofs, they sang the evening psalms. After tending the sick, they knelt once more beneath familiar stone arches. Their rhythm did not ignore suffering. It helped them endure it. Several chronicles describe communities praying specifically for favorable weather. Processions moved through monastery grounds and nearby fields. Ancient hymns echoed across rain-soaked farmland. Modern readers may debate the effectiveness of such practices. For medieval people, however, these ceremonies expressed hope during circumstances largely beyond human control. Nature remained mysterious. Faith provided meaning where certainty proved impossible. Gradually, after several painfully difficult seasons, conditions improved in many regions. Harvests recovered, roads dried, markets slowly revived. Children born after the famine knew those terrible years only through stories told by their grandparents. Life resumed its familiar rhythm. The monastery gardens became green once more. Granaries gradually refilled. Pilgrims returned in greater numbers. Relief spread quietly across the countryside. Many believed the worst had passed. Sadly, history had something even more devastating waiting just beyond the horizon. The famine had weakened countless communities. Malnutrition had left many bodies vulnerable. Trade routes, once symbols of recovery, now connected distant regions more closely than ever before. Ships crossed the Mediterranean. Merchant caravans traveled familiar roads. Ports bustled with activity. Goods moved faster. So did something no one could see. Far away, beyond the awareness of nearly every European monastery, an invisible threat had already begun its journey westward. No monk copying manuscripts beneath the calm light of the Scriptorium could possibly imagine that within a few years, monastery bells would ring not merely to mark the hours, but to announce funerals so frequently that silence itself would become unfamiliar. The first reports sounded almost unbelievable. Travelers arriving from distant ports spoke of entire neighborhoods falling strangely silent. Merchants claimed that ships reached harbor carrying far fewer sailors than had departed. Some insisted that towns in the east had buried hundreds of people within only a few weeks. Others dismissed these stories as exaggerations, the kind that often grew larger with every retelling. The monks had heard alarming rumors before. Armies had supposedly numbered in the hundreds of thousands, when they had been only a fraction of that size. Entire kingdoms had been said to collapse overnight, only to continue much as before. Extraordinary tales traveled quickly along medieval roads. Truth often arrived more slowly. Life inside the monastery, therefore, continued according to its familiar rhythm. The bell still echoed before dawn. The brothers gathered in the church. The gardeners tended the spring vegetables. The scribes bent over their desks. The baker measured flour with practiced hands. The infirmarian checked on elderly monks recovering from ordinary illnesses. Nothing yet suggested that history itself was approaching their gates. Then the news became impossible to ignore. A respected bishop died unexpectedly. A neighboring monastery reported losing several brothers within only a few days. Merchants who had visited thriving cities returned describing streets that had become strangely empty. Letters arrived more slowly because the men carrying them had fallen ill along the road. One by one, rumors became reports. Reports became certainty. An unfamiliar disease was moving across Europe with frightening speed. Today, historians know this catastrophe as the Black Death, one of the deadliest pandemics in recorded history. The monks did not know its cause. They had never heard the word bacteria. They understood nothing about fleas carrying disease from infected rats. The microscopic world remained completely invisible to medieval science. People searched desperately for explanations. Some believed unusual weather had poisoned the air. Others blamed strange alignments of the planets. Many interpreted the disaster through deeply religious beliefs. Physicians argued, priests prayed, ordinary families simply hoped the sickness would somehow pass their homes. Inside the monastery, concern gradually turned into preparation. The infirmary was cleaned more carefully than usual. Fresh bedding was arranged. Medicinal herbs were gathered in larger quantities. Water supplies were checked. The brothers prayed together with increasing urgency. Still, they possessed no effective way to stop what was coming. Then, one afternoon, the monastery gate opened for a visitor, unlike any who had arrived before. A local farmer, pale and exhausted, leaned heavily upon his son's shoulder. He struggled to breathe. His fever was obvious, even from several steps away. The infirmarian immediately recognized that this was no ordinary illness. Within hours, the man's condition worsened dramatically. Pain spread through his body. Dark swellings appeared beneath his arms. Before another sunrise, he was dead. Soon afterward, His son developed the same symptoms. The brothers buried them quietly. Only a few days later, another family arrived. Then another. Then another. The monastery infirmary, designed to care for occasional illnesses among a relatively small community, suddenly overflowed. Beds filled, blankets disappeared, simple herbal remedies ran low. The brothers worked almost without rest. Some prepared food for the sick, others carried water. Several remained beside dying patients through long nights, so that no one would face death entirely alone. No medieval treatment could cure the plague. The monks knew this soon enough, yet they continued caring for those who suffered, because compassion did not depend upon guaranteed success. Many paid dearly for that decision. Unlike people who fled at the first signs of danger, monks often remained where they were. Their vows tied them to their communities. Leaving everyone behind rarely seemed acceptable. Consequently, many religious houses experienced devastating losses. One sick traveler unknowingly infected a caregiver. That caregiver unknowingly spread illness to another brother. Shared meals, shared dormitories, shared worship, the very closeness that strengthened monastic life now increased the danger. Some monasteries lost only a handful of monks. Others lost half their communities. A few nearly disappeared altogether. One chronicler described the eerie silence after so many brothers had died. The church that once echoed with strong voices now sounded strangely empty. Long dining tables contained only a few remaining occupants. Beds in the dormitory stood unused. The familiar rhythm continued, but the people creating that rhythm had vanished. The psychological burden proved enormous. Imagine living beside the same companions for 30 years, working together every day, praying together every morning and evening, sharing meals in silence, watching seasons pass together. Then, within a matter of weeks, many of those familiar faces disappear forever. No amount of discipline could prevent grief. The monks mourned deeply. Historical records often mention the deaths briefly, almost matter-of-factly. Yet behind those restrained sentences lay profound personal loss. One surviving monk might now perform work previously shared among 4 brothers. The elderly gardener was gone. The experienced scribe had died. The cellarer, who knew every corner of the granary, was buried last week. The choir sounded different because familiar voices no longer joined the hymns. Every ordinary task reminded survivors of someone who had once stood beside them. The cemetery expanded rapidly. Graves that had once appeared gradually across many years now accumulated within days. Simple wooden crosses filled new sections of monastery grounds. Funeral prayers became heartbreakingly familiar. The bell that usually marked the passing hours now rang repeatedly for burials. Visitors arriving months later sometimes remarked upon how different the monastery felt. not because the buildings had changed. The buildings remained much the same. The people had changed. Entire generations of experience had disappeared. The loss extended beyond emotion. Knowledge vanished as well. A monk who had spent 40 years mastering herbal medicine left behind notes. But notes could never capture every lesson learned through decades of observation. An expert carpenter died before completing the apprenticeship of his successor. A skilled singer who knew hundreds of chants from memory took many of them to the grave. Libraries preserved books. They could not preserve living experience with equal perfection. Even so, remarkable acts of courage quietly unfolded amid the tragedy. Some brothers volunteered to care for infected villages despite understanding the risks. Others distributed food until monastery supplies became dangerously low. Several chronicles mention monks who refused to abandon dying strangers found beside the roads. Few of those men expected recognition. Most never received it. Their names disappeared into history almost as quickly as they themselves had. Yet their actions reflected ideals that had shaped monastic life for centuries. To serve rather than seek comfort, to remain rather than flee, to help even when success seemed unlikely. As months slowly passed, the plague eventually loosened its grip on many regions, not because people had discovered an effective cure. The disease simply moved on, leaving changed communities behind. The surviving monks emerged into a world that scarcely resembled the one they had known. Nearby villages contained fewer families. Some farms stood abandoned. Labor became scarce. Fields once carefully cultivated slowly returned to grass. Entire parishes lacked enough priests. Several neighboring monasteries had become so small that they could no longer function independently. Communities merged. Buildings fell into disrepair. The old order of medieval life had been shaken to its foundations. For the monks who remained alive, every familiar path through the cloister carried memories. Here walked the old librarian. There worked the blacksmith, who had taught 3 generations of novices. That garden had belonged to a brother, whose laughter everyone remembered. Silence acquired a different meaning. It no longer represented only spiritual discipline. Sometimes it reflected absence. Yet history possesses an extraordinary habit of continuing. Even after unimaginable tragedy, the bells still rang. Seeds still entered the soil. Books still waited to be copied. Children were still born in nearby villages. Young novices eventually knocked upon the monastery gate, knowing little of the terrible years that older brothers could never forget. Slowly, almost reluctantly, life began again, but Europe itself had changed forever, and the monasteries would soon discover that recovering from the plague was only the beginning of a completely new age, one in which their place in society would be questioned more than ever before. The years following the Great Plague felt strangely unfamiliar. The monastery still stood where it always had. Morning sunlight still touched the same bell tower. The cloister still echoed with measured footsteps. The gardens slowly returned to life. At first glance, an ordinary visitor might have believed that little had changed. The older monks knew otherwise. Every corner of the monastery carried invisible memories. The empty seat beside the refectory wall, the unused writing desk in the scriptorium, the workshop where a skilled carpenter had once shaped oak beams with remarkable precision, the small herb garden carefully planted by a brother who never returned from the infirmary. Time softened grief, but it never erased it completely. New novices eventually arrived. Many had been children when the plague swept through Europe. Some had lost parents. Others came from villages where only half the original families remained. A few had witnessed entire streets standing abandoned. Unlike earlier generations, these young men entered monasteries already understanding how quickly ordinary life could disappear. Their childhood memories had been shaped by uncertainty. The older monks recognized this difference almost immediately. These newcomers asked different questions. They spoke with unusual seriousness for their age. Death no longer felt like a distant subject discussed only during sermons. It had become part of their earliest memories. Teaching such novices required patience. The lessons extended beyond Latin grammar and religious instruction. The elderly brothers quietly demonstrated something perhaps even more valuable: perseverance. One morning at a time, one prayer at a time, one harvest at a time. The monastery had survived because previous generations refused to abandon hope, even when surrounded by loss. That example now became part of the education offered to every newcomer. Outside the monastery walls, Europe also struggled to recover. The plague had dramatically reduced the population. In many regions, fields once cultivated for generations now lay empty. Landowners discovered they lacked enough workers. Entire villages disappeared from maps after the last inhabitants either died or moved elsewhere. Forests slowly reclaimed abandoned farmland. Stone cottages collapsed beneath weather and neglect. Roads leading to forgotten settlements gradually vanished beneath grass and wildflowers. Travelers occasionally encountered lonely church towers standing above villages that no longer existed. Such sights reminded everyone how fragile even long-established communities could be. Yet scarcity created unexpected opportunities as well. With fewer laborers available, surviving workers often found their skills more valuable than before. Farmers negotiated better conditions. Craftsmen earned higher wages. Young apprentices discovered choices that earlier generations rarely possessed. Society slowly began changing in ways few people immediately recognized. The monastery noticed these changes sooner than many outsiders expected. Recruiting new workers became more difficult. Hiring experienced builders cost considerably more. Maintaining distant farmland required fresh arrangements with local tenants. The cellarer spent increasing amounts of time adjusting agreements that had remained stable for decades before the plague. Economic life quietly entered a new chapter. Another subtle transformation unfolded inside the monastery library. Before the plague, scribes had copied manuscripts almost continuously. Now there were fewer trained copyists. Some had died, others had grown too old. Replacing decades of experience proved impossible overnight. Consequently, each remaining scribe carried greater responsibility. The work demanded extraordinary concentration. One elderly monk spent years teaching two promising novices every detail of manuscript production: how to prepare parchment, how to sharpen a quill, how much pressure to apply while forming each letter, how to mix ink without wasting precious ingredients, when to stop writing before tired eyes invited mistakes. These lessons rarely appeared fully within written instructions. They lived in careful demonstrations. The teacher adjusted a student's hand slightly. He corrected posture. He explained why one letter looked balanced, while another leaned awkwardly across the page. Learning resembled apprenticeship as much as formal education. The younger monks respected these aging teachers deeply. Many realized they represented the final connection to an earlier world. Some instructors remembered monasteries before the plague. They recalled crowded choirs, busy workshops, festive gatherings attended by neighboring villages. To the youngest novices, such stories sounded almost unbelievable. History had already become memory. Meanwhile, another innovation slowly began spreading across parts of Europe. Paper. For centuries, parchment made from animal skins had served as the primary writing material for valuable manuscripts. It remained durable, beautiful, reliable. It was also expensive. Paper, introduced gradually through contacts with the Islamic world and expanding trade, offered an increasingly practical alternative for many purposes. At first, some monks viewed it with skepticism. Could something so thin truly last? Would ink fade more quickly? Could important records safely be entrusted to this unfamiliar material? Opinions differed. Certain monasteries continued preferring parchment for their finest books. Others cautiously embraced paper where appropriate. The change happened slowly. Centuries often move at a gentler pace than modern readers expect. Even so, it signaled that the world beyond monastery walls continued introducing new ideas. Technology, although advancing gradually, never stopped entirely. Visitors also became more numerous once roads recovered. Pilgrims resumed their journeys. Merchants carried goods between growing towns. Messengers arrived bearing official letters. Among these travelers came an increasing number of educated people who had never lived in monasteries. University scholars, lawyers, physicians, government officials. They discussed subjects once associated primarily with monastic learning: astronomy, logic, classical philosophy, Roman law, medicine. The conversations fascinated many monks. Some welcomed the expanding exchange of knowledge. Others worried that learning separated from spiritual discipline might become prideful. The debate remained respectful in many places, yet it reflected an important transition. Knowledge no longer belonged almost exclusively to monasteries. It had found new homes. One afternoon, a visiting scholar spent several days examining the monastery library. He expressed genuine admiration for manuscripts copied generations earlier. Without those books, he explained, many ancient authors would have been completely unknown to university students. The elderly librarian listened quietly. His expression revealed both satisfaction and humility. The monastery had not preserved those texts for fame. It had simply continued the patient work and trusted to previous generations. Now others benefited. Perhaps that alone justified centuries of careful labor. Another responsibility increasingly occupied monastery leaders: education beyond their own walls. Some monasteries operated schools for boys from nearby communities. Not every student intended to become a monk. Many eventually returned home. Others entered royal service. Some became priests. A few pursued university studies. Teaching therefore connected monasteries with the broader society more closely than before. Classrooms echoed with voices practicing Latin vocabulary. Wax tablets filled with careful handwriting. Teachers corrected pronunciation repeatedly. Discipline remained firm. Although medieval schoolboys occasionally displayed the same restless energy familiar to teachers in every century, historical records preserve amusing complaints about distracted pupils. One student preferred watching birds through the window. Another repeatedly misplaced his writing tools. Someone else daydreamed instead of memorizing grammar. Human nature offered comforting consistency across the ages. The monastery kitchen also reflected changing times, although simplicity remained an ideal. New ingredients slowly reached Europe through expanding trade networks. Different spices occasionally appeared. Improved farming methods increased certain harvests. Recipes evolved gradually without abandoning traditional moderation. Festival meals remained special. Ordinary meals remained plain. Balance mattered more than extravagance. By now, several decades had passed since the terrible years of plague. Children born afterward were becoming adults. Many knew the catastrophe only through stories told by grandparents and elderly monks. History quietly transformed into memory once again. Yet those older brothers never forgot. whenever a sudden fever spread through nearby villages, concern resurfaced immediately. Whenever unusual rumors arrived from distant ports, memories stirred. Experience had taught them that ordinary days should never be taken for granted. As evening settled across the monastery one autumn, an elderly monk walked slowly through the cloister with a young novice beside him. The novice admired the beautiful stone arches, the peaceful garden, and the quiet fountain at its center. "It feels," the young man whispered, "as though this place has always been the same." The old monk smiled gently. He looked around the familiar courtyard, then toward the cemetery, where generations of brothers rested beneath simple stones. Finally, he answered with remarkable wisdom. "The stones may appear unchanged," he said softly, "but every generation leaves them carrying different memories." The novice considered those words carefully. He could not yet understand their full meaning. One day he would, because history never truly stands still, even as monasteries slowly recovered from one of Europe's darkest disasters. Another force was quietly approaching, not a disease, nor an invading army, but a revolutionary invention that would transform books, learning, and the very purpose of the medieval scribe forever. For generations, the sound of a quill scratching across parchment had been as familiar inside the monastery as the ringing of its bells. Morning after morning, the scribes entered the scriptorium, arranged their ink pots, trimmed the tips of their feathers with small knives, and resumed work exactly where they had stopped the previous evening. One careful letter followed another. Entire pages slowly emerged from patient hands. A single chapter might require several days. An entire Bible could occupy years. No one hurried. Hurrying only created mistakes. A misplaced word required careful correction. A drop of spilled ink could ruin weeks of effort. Patience remained the greatest skill any scribe possessed. Many of these men never expected anyone outside their monastery to know their names. That hardly mattered. They believed the work itself mattered more than the worker. When one manuscript was finished, another quietly replaced it. The cycle continued. It had continued for centuries. It seemed as though it always would. Yet somewhere in the German city of Mainz, during the middle of the 15th century, a craftsman named Johannes Gutenberg was experimenting with an idea that would eventually reach even the quietest monastery. The monks did not know his name, at least not at first. News traveled slowly. Months sometimes passed before important developments reached distant communities. Even then, information often arrived incomplete. Travelers began mentioning a curious invention. Instead of copying every page by hand, they claimed books could somehow be produced using movable pieces of metal. Some listeners laughed politely. Others looked puzzled. Several simply assumed the travelers had misunderstood what they had seen. Surely no machine could replace the skill of an experienced scribe. After all, writing required judgment. Beautiful handwriting demanded years of practice. Decorated initials were works of art. How could pieces of metal imitate that? The stories continued. More merchants repeated them. University scholars discussed them with increasing excitement. Letters described workshops where dozens of identical pages emerged far more quickly than any human hand could manage. Eventually, one visiting priest arrived carrying something extraordinary. A printed book. Several monks gathered around the unfamiliar volume. At first glance, it appeared surprisingly ordinary. The letters looked neat. The lines remained remarkably straight. The pages matched one another with astonishing precision. One elderly scribe carefully turned several leaves, then several more. He paused. Something about the text seemed almost too consistent. Every letter possessed exactly the same shape. No tiny variations revealed the personality of an individual writer. No slight differences in spacing hinted at a tired hand near the end of a long day. The pages appeared almost perfectly uniform. For a moment, the room remained silent, not because the brothers disliked the book, because they realized they were witnessing the beginning of something entirely new. The younger novices reacted with excitement. Imagine how many books this could produce. Imagine villages that had never owned a library suddenly possessing shelves filled with learning. Imagine universities obtaining textbooks much more easily. The possibilities seemed endless. Several older monks responded more cautiously, not with fear, with thoughtful curiosity. Every important invention carried both advantages and unforeseen consequences. Would printed books remain accurate? Who would supervise their contents? Would careless printers spread mistakes more quickly than careful scribes ever could? Would beautiful manuscript art disappear? These questions deserved serious discussion. No one yet knew the answers. The monastery abbot listened patiently as opinions filled the chapter house. Some brothers believed nothing important would change. Others quietly suspected that everything might. History would eventually prove the second group correct. Printing transformed Europe with astonishing speed. Books that once required years to produce could now appear in far greater numbers. Prices gradually declined. Students purchased texts previously available only in wealthy libraries. Ideas traveled farther than ever before. Knowledge, once limited by the speed of human handwriting, began moving with entirely different momentum. For monasteries, this development created mixed emotions. On one hand, they celebrated the wider spread of learning. Many religious communities enthusiastically purchased printed books. Libraries expanded more rapidly. Errors introduced by generations of copying became easier to compare and correct. Scripture reached more readers. Scholarship flourished. On the other hand, an ancient profession slowly began changing. The monastery scribe. For centuries, his work had stood near the center of intellectual life. Now fewer handwritten copies were required. Several scriptoria reduced their activities. Others shifted toward preserving older manuscripts rather than creating entirely new ones. The change happened gradually. Many monasteries continued copying books for decades. Illuminated manuscripts remained prized works of art. Special ceremonial books still demanded extraordinary craftsmanship. Yet everyone understood that the old world had begun fading. One elderly scribe accepted these changes with surprising peace. A young novice once asked whether he felt disappointed that machines now performed work he had devoted his entire life to mastering. The old monk smiled. He gently closed the manuscript resting before him. "My task," he answered, "was never to preserve my occupation." The novice looked puzzled. The old man continued, "My task was to preserve knowledge." He rested one weathered hand upon the printed book lying nearby. "If these pages carry wisdom farther than my own hands ever could, then perhaps this is not an ending." It was a remarkably generous perspective. Not everyone shared it. Some mourned the gradual disappearance of traditional manuscript culture. Others embraced printing enthusiastically. Most simply adapted as circumstances changed. That ability to adapt had always helped monasteries survive. Centuries earlier, they had cleared forests. Later, they had built stone churches. They had endured famine. They had survived plague. Now they adjusted once again. The monastery library itself slowly transformed. Shelves that once contained almost entirely handwritten manuscripts gradually welcomed printed volumes. The difference remained obvious. Handwritten books possessed individual personalities, tiny imperfections, colorful initials, occasional humorous drawings hiding in the margins. Printed books offered remarkable consistency. Each copy resembled the next. Knowledge became easier to share, even if some artistic uniqueness diminished. Interestingly, the monks soon discovered that printing did not eliminate careful scholarship. Quite the opposite. Someone still needed to compare texts, correct mistakes, organize libraries, teach students, translate ancient languages, preserve fragile manuscripts from earlier centuries. The nature of the work changed. The need for dedicated scholars did not disappear. Outside the monastery walls, ordinary villagers noticed another consequence. Books slowly became less mysterious. Previously, many people might spend their entire lives without owning a single volume. Now, although books remained valuable, they gradually became more accessible than before. Education expanded. Literacy slowly increased. Ideas traveled more rapidly between cities. A sermon delivered in one region might soon be discussed hundreds of miles away because printed pages carried it there. the pace of history quietly accelerated. The older monks often reflected upon how much had changed during their lifetimes. Some had entered the monastery before printing existed. They remembered rooms filled with scribes. They remembered years spent copying a single large manuscript. Now younger brothers discussed printers, typefaces, and newly published works almost casually. Within one lifetime, the world had become recognizably different, yet certain things refused to change. The morning bell still rang before sunrise. The choir still gathered for prayer. The gardens still required tending. Guests still knocked upon the monastery, gate seeking shelter. The poor still needed bread. The sick still required care. Technology altered methods. It did not erase compassion. One autumn evening, after completing the day's work, several brothers walked quietly beneath the cloister arches. A novice asked whether future generations would remember the monks who had copied books for centuries. The librarian considered the question before answering. "Perhaps they will not remember our names," he said, "but if they can still read the wisdom we preserved, then they have remembered the most important part." His words reflected a truth visible throughout medieval history. The greatest achievements of many monks were never intended to bring personal fame. They planted trees whose fruit they would never taste. They built churches whose completion they would never witness. They copied books that strangers centuries later would quietly read. They accepted lives measured not by applause, but by faithful repetition. Yet an even greater storm was gathering beyond the monastery walls. This time, it would not arrive through disease or technology. It would come through ideas powerful enough to divide kingdoms, challenge centuries of tradition, and forever change the fate of thousands of monasteries across Europe. Those ideas arrived gradually at first, carried by students, merchants, priests, and printed books that traveled farther than any handwritten manuscript ever could. Debates that once remained confined to university halls now spread across towns and villages with remarkable speed. Questions about church authority, religious practices, and the proper way to live a Christian life began appearing in places where such discussions had rarely occurred before. Inside the monastery, the brothers noticed the change almost immediately. Visitors asked sharper questions. Travelers discussed controversial sermons. Printed pamphlets circulated from hand to hand. Some praised the old traditions. Others criticized them openly. For the first time in centuries, many monasteries found themselves defending practices that earlier generations had simply accepted. The challenge was not merely intellectual. It became political. Powerful rulers realized that monasteries controlled extensive lands, valuable buildings, and considerable wealth. If religious authority weakened, secular governments might gain opportunities that had once seemed impossible. Across parts of Europe, alliances shifted. Some princes supported reform. Others remained loyal to traditional church structures. The monastery, which had survived famine, plague, and economic change, now faced a different kind of uncertainty. One winter evening, the abbot gathered the community in the chapter house. Candles flickered against the stone walls while the brothers listened in unusual silence. "We may soon live through difficult years," he told them quietly. "Whatever happens beyond these walls, remember why this house was founded." No dramatic speech followed. No promises that everything would remain unchanged. The older monks understood the situation too well for that. Over the following decades, some monasteries continued much as before. Others were reformed under new rules. A number were dissolved entirely, their lands transferred to kings or nobles. Libraries were scattered. Bells were removed. Cloisters that had echoed with prayer for centuries gradually fell silent. For many monks, the most painful loss was not personal comfort, but the disappearance of communities built across generations. A monastery represented hundreds of intertwined lives. Gardeners, scribes, cooks, teachers, physicians, and choir monks had all contributed to something larger than themselves. When such a community ended, an entire way of life vanished with it. Yet even during those turbulent years, remarkable acts of dignity appeared. Some brothers carefully packed precious manuscripts to protect them from destruction. Others found new homes in surviving religious houses. A few remained in former monasteries as parish priests or teachers, continuing to serve nearby villagers even after the old community had dissolved. And many ordinary people quietly remembered the kindness they had received from monks over the years. Shelter during storms, bread during famine, medicine during illness, education for their children, prayers for their dead. Centuries passed. The great medieval monasteries became ruins, museums, parish churches, universities, or private estates. Ivy climbed walls once scrubbed clean by novices. Tourists walked through cloisters where generations of monks had moved in silence before dawn. The workshops fell quiet. The scriptoria disappeared. The dormitories emptied. But something unexpected remained. The books survived. The gardens inspired later generations. The architectural knowledge endured. The hospital traditions influenced future medicine. The libraries preserved ancient learning that might otherwise have vanished forever. And the stories of those strange, disciplined lives continued to fascinate people long after the bells had stopped ringing. When modern visitors stand beneath the arches of an old monastery, they often notice the silence first. It feels different from ordinary silence. The stone seems to remember centuries of footsteps, whispered prayers, turning pages, and distant bells. The monks themselves would probably find that surprising. Most never expected to be remembered. They rose before dawn. They worked. They prayed. They copied books. They planted gardens. They cared for the sick. They buried their friends. They welcomed strangers. Then they did the same again. the next day. To modern eyes, their lives can appear strange, waking in darkness, speaking through hand signals, eating in silence while someone read aloud, sleeping on simple beds, and following bells that controlled every hour. Yet perhaps the strangest thing about medieval monks was not their silence, their fasting, or their unusual routines. It was their willingness to devote an entire lifetime to small acts repeated faithfully over decades, believing that patience, discipline, and service could quietly shape the world long after their own names had been forgotten. And in many ways, they were right. If you want to continue the journey, the next video is waiting.